biggest issue I have is that there's billions being spent on infrastructure trying to achieve higher performance decentralized compute. But if your data isn't decentralized, there's very limited reason to use decentralized compute. To feed centralized data into decentralized compute, to me, that calculus doesn't stack up.
Hello, and welcome to Public Key. This is your host, Ian Andrews. When I say the word oracle, you might imagine the classical Greek priestesses, like the oracle at Delphi. Oracles were thought to be portals through which the gods spoke directly to people. But of course, this podcast is about the world of crypto, and here in this modern context, the word oracle has taken on new meaning. Oracles in the blockchain context connect off-chain data to blockchain transactions. In this episode, I speak with the co-founder and CEO of Flare Network, Hugo. Flare is a new Layer 1 blockchain that's prioritized decentralization and enshrined oracles natively into the node architecture. During our conversation, Hugo shares his journey from the high-pressure world of hedge fund trading to blockchain and explains why he sees an increasing need for decentralized data in an industry that heavily relies on information from data providers. We go deep on Flare's architecture and how that enables cost-effective and secure data oracles, while being sure to differentiate the Flare solution from alternatives that Hugo describes as potentially vulnerable due to lack of decentralization. Hugo even explains how KYC and AML can be integrated by developers building on Flare, and how important regulation is to move the industry forward. After the episode, I encourage you to check out our mid-year crypto crime report, where the team looks into topics that include China-based CSAM and cybercrime networks, and how pig butchering scams remain lucrative. Our research team compiled some amazing findings. Now, on to the episode. Today I'm joined by Hugo, who is co-founder at Flare and CEO of Flare Labs. Hugo, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ian, thanks for having me.
Hugo, I'm fascinated to learn about Flare Labs. It's a big project. Maybe, since I'm guessing many of our listeners haven't heard of that before, we can start with just a brief overview of what you're building at Flare.
Absolutely. We're building what we think of as the best platform for data in the space. Flare, as a network, is an EVM layer 1, and it's the first network to have enshrined oracles integrated into the network itself. And so those are oracles for prices, oracles for Web 2 proofs, oracles for Web 3 proofs. So this allows developers to build very feature-rich applications which get their data directly from the network in a highly decentralized and heavily secured way.
It sounds really exciting. I want to dive in. I have so many questions about the technical details, but before we jump to that, tell us a little bit about your background. How did you find yourself in this world of blockchain and cryptocurrency?
So I was a trader at a number of two hedge funds. I was a trader of derivatives, primarily commodity derivatives. And I sort of got to the point in my career where 2015, 2016, where I decided I really didn't want to continue in that career. I felt frustrated, I felt bored. I didn't like having to chase returns. It can be quite soul destroying, especially when you don't feel like you're really building anything. I also didn't want to turn into most of the other people in my office, a sort of middle-aged alcoholic on their third wife. I thought I'd leave, and I did. And I went back to university to study machine learning. And that's where I met my two co-founders.
And how did you go from machine learning into the world of blockchain and crypto? That doesn't seem like necessarily a natural evolution, but I don't think anyone finds ourselves in this industry on a straight line path.
So I was interested in statistics. I suppose my undergrad was primarily risk management and financial engineering, so I had a strong background in statistics, simulation, modeling, that kind of stuff, very close to machine learning. So as a thing to go and have a study, machine learning was a very interesting and highly related aspect to, I suppose, my undergrad and a lot of the work I was doing whilst I was at a number of funds. And so I didn't really want to go into machine learning AI after studying, because arguably at that time, and still to this day, AI and ML is really the preserve of very large tech organizations. And whilst crypto focuses on decentralizing banks and governments as their centralizing forces, really tech companies are also very heavy centralizing forces. And not wanting to go back into straight out of the frying pan and into the fire, I really didn't want to go directly to AI. And secondly, really at the time then, and again, I would say still to this day, despite the advances and the hype in AI as it is today isn't that useful. I need to be careful what I say, but it's not that useful. There are not that many mission critical things that you would want to use AI for. It's still fairly early, and there's a number of reasons for this, from siloing of useful data within large and medium-sized companies that can't and don't use the data, to the complexities of being able to rely on the outputs of singular probabilistic models for mission-critical tasks. I think the use of blockchain to improve aspects of AI is real and could have a fundamental effect on the usefulness of AI in the future. I couldn't claim to be thinking about that back then, but I'm very glad I went into blockchain and not directly into AI.
I think it's an astute observation. This idea of, I've spent a lot of time thinking about recently, is sort of the verifiability of data in a world where the marginal cost to create real seeming data, whether that's video or audio or textual information, has sort of gone to zero. It starts to make sense to have systems that can verify authenticity and point of creation in a technically provable way. So I'm not sure if that was what you were alluding to, or you have a different perspective on it that you'd like to share.
Well, I think we've been doing a lot of work on where blockchain and AI can intersect. And we recently put out a paper called Consensus Learning, which is about collaborative AI. You have issues with probabilistic models that really they're just drawing inferences from probability distributions. And when you want to make a decision, a really, really important decision, like does this person have cancer? Is this car about to crash? Do we need to take action? You want a very high degree of safety. Today's models don't necessarily provide that. And so we think that there's a form of collaborative machine learning or AI that can essentially mitigate the risks inherent in singular models. There's also a lot of other areas where AI can be used with blockchain at, like you say, the verifiability of things. That's something I think we'll probably come onto in this chat, but I think those are potentially big use cases. But I think I see the biggest use case for blockchain and AI as blockchain being able to make AI fundamentally better.
Super interesting. Connect that to what you're doing at Flare now. I'm always fascinated when I talk to someone that is launching a new chain, because I think there's the mass of people who interact with blockchains in some way sort of orbit around Bitcoin and Ethereum predominantly, and then a very long tail of layer 1 and layer 2 chains. Now we've got this kind of ecosystem of app-specific chains like what the folks at Celestia are doing. What led you and your co-founders down the path of saying, you know what, we need to create a new L1?
So fundamentally, we think that data in the space is somewhat broken. And we wanted to build a platform as an organization. We spent 2 years really before we hit what we wanted to do. So really from late 2017 to about 2019, we were kind of thinking, researching, not necessarily jumping onto let's build something today. We were just really exploring the space because we'd come out of a non-crypto background and we wanted to make sure that we were thinking in the right direction. And we fundamentally think that data is poorly served in the industry. So we wanted to build a layer 1. Well, we wanted to build a platform where Oracle's data close to being as secure as the network itself. So we're building Flare, and Flare is really the only major layer 1 with enshrined oracles. And that is the Oracle system is built into the network and derives its security in a similar manner to proof of stake. So this means that full validator set is needed if you want them staked. And so this rules out things like launching on Solana and rules out being an L2. And even with these newer shared security models like EigenLayer, shared security would introduce to our minds intolerable risks to the data side that are very, very hard to get over. So from our perspective, enshrining the oracles into the network has very, very substantial upsides beyond security.
That makes sense. You made a comment a moment ago that data in the crypto landscape is sort of fundamentally broken. Can you be more specific? Maybe a couple examples that we can latch onto.
So, I think the biggest issue I have is that there's billions being spent on infrastructure trying to achieve higher performance decentralized compute. But if your data isn't decentralized, there's very limited reason to use decentralized compute, to feed centralized data into decentralized compute. To me, that calculus doesn't stack up.
Okay, so if I think about sort of the constraining factor in most blockchains is block space, like fairly limited. And so most people are offloading data related to whatever's actually getting represented on chain. Maybe the easiest example comes to mind is with NFTs. where the actual art associated with most NFTs sits in a file system somewhere off the blockchain, and the on-chain representation is just a pointer to a file location, a URI of some point, some sort. Some of those do use decentralized file storage like IPFS. We recently had someone from the Filecoin Foundation on the podcast, but a lot of it sits in Amazon S3. Am I tracking kind of the point you're making there, that if we're keeping all our data in something like S3, that we're not really getting to the decentralization?
I'd go a lot further. I'd say that existing Oracle systems not giving you decentralization, and then not giving you safety. NFTs are one aspect, relatively small market cap relative to the amount of value that's being transacted across protocols that are pulling data from existing Oracle systems. To us, it doesn't really compute that if you're using essentially centralized data, you really don't need to pay for block space. You can just do it all in Amazon S3 anyway.
Right. I think that would probably be the critic of people that look at a lot of the application architectures that get built on blockchain. It's like, wow, you've gone and done a huge amount of engineering work to make a blockchain inside of an app that probably would be fairly straightforward otherwise. But let's dive in on specifically your critique of the status quo is that most of the applications running on blockchains today, so thinking about automated market makers or DEXs, they depend on pricing data, which is usually supplied by an Oracle, and that system is inherently not decentralized, and so therefore less good than we would want it in an idealized system.
Just to pick you up on that, I mean, ANMs thankfully don't depend on data, or at least most of the versions we're familiar with, like Uniswap. Lending protocols do, perps DEXs do. Anything financial, real world assets that needs to have a price does. Anything to do with being able to do proofs from other chains or from Web 2 into the space needs data. And to give you an example of where this is falling down, the lowest number of data providers, if you take existing Oracle systems, the lowest number of data providers that is serving a particular price there is 5. It's an incredibly low threshold for collusion.
I think I understand the problem now fully. So let's talk about the solution with Flare. What does it really mean to have an Oracle embedded into the chain? What does that look like? And maybe you can compare and contrast against like a Ethereum architecture that people are probably familiar with.
So Flare's protocols are solving for cost, security, and flexibility. By enshrining the oracles into the chain, as in integrating both the infrastructure and the security budget that it's staking into one role and having a single token, Flare's able to offer data at a much lower cost than a third-party oracle like Chainlink or Pith, because they ultimately are equal users of the chain like everyone else. Much of the data on Flare is free because of that, and it means that we also don't have to have a token, which means that we can keep our data free and the network can benefit by people building with that data, using it in their applications and generating transaction volume. And secondly, by unifying the security of the network with the Oracle through merging that validator and data provider role, we can maximize the decentralization and the security budget. Flare has 100 infrastructure providers who are providing validation, but each one of them is contributing to every single price. On Flare, we can have up to 1,000 prices updated every single block, and each one of our 100 infrastructure providers is contributing to every price. We have about 67% of the circulating supply of our token securing those infrastructure providers in some way, either staked directly or delegated to their oracles. And so in terms of the decentralization, having a large number of providers providing a price, and on Flare, there's essentially a cohesive number of providers providing a price, and having a very, very high security budget, no other project really comes close to sort of providing that level of protection around data. And lastly, because we've built the Oracle into the chain, we have had a lot of flexibility on the design, which means that we can optimize the chain for being able to handle data, being able to minimize the cost of handling that data. And whereas third-party oracles are very constrained by the network they're operating on, they're constrained to the design decisions made by another network.
Do you have a specific example of some of those design constraints that don't apply in the Flare context?
For instance, we can give a rebate within the network for submitting prices. During periods of very, very high traffic, we can essentially charge the standard gas fee, but rebate that back later.
Interesting. Quite a bit different than the architecture that people are probably familiar with on other networks. So my role as a validator in, say, Ethereum, I'm basically accepting requested transactions, producing blocks ultimately, I have to have some amount of ETH in the node. If I'm running a full node on my own, like 32 ETH, if I start falling down on my responsibilities to accept transactions and produce blocks, or I'm trying to manipulate them in some way, eventually that catches up. My staked assets or rewards will be struck. And if I do things like don't keep the node up or operate the right way, all my assets are kind of ultimately at risk. Same basic concept here, but then I have an added responsibility of providing this Oracle data as well. Is that right?
On Flare, you'll earn 0 validated rewards unless you're also part of the Oracle and submitting.
And how does that work? Like, let's say that the data is not inherently on the chain. So it's some piece of information that I need to pull in, like you mentioned real world asset prices earlier. I need to collect that from somewhere. Does that mean that every entity, your 100 infrastructure providers, need to then figure out how to go and collect that commodity price data from somewhere?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we were shocked when we launched what we call our canary net, which is called Songbird, how quickly that happened.
Yeah.
And how quickly actually machine learning took over, how quickly people started integrating machine learning into their role as a data provider in order to essentially provide something that was getting into the rewarded set. So essentially their machine learning was interpolating where the price was when they sampled it versus where they thought the price would be when the submission is revealed. And that's been very interesting to watch. In fact, there's been an arms race within our Oracle in order to provide a better signal.
Interesting. What happens when someone wants a new piece of data that doesn't exist? Like, how does that then get added to the Oracle set?
So this is quite nice. We have 100 data providers. We have an ability to upgrade or update, what the prices are, what's being put onto the chain essentially. And that's, just a very simple governance system whereby people make a request, the providers look at the request and they vote across themselves whether they feel that they can add it.
Fascinating. Democratic governance around data access and control. I recently had the head of product from Chainlink Labs on the podcast, and one of the things that they seemed to be very focused on was kind of the next generation of their architecture, which enables, they call it the cross-chain interoperability protocol, or CCIP. And so they seem to be moving up stack in some ways from just being kind of the classic Oracle data provider feed to a general purpose message broker across multiple chains, which in theory also allows not just information, but actual value to flow between chains. And their argument was better than bridges, more secure because of the nature of the validation security architecture. I'm curious, like, as you think about people using Flare, there's always this challenge of like, well, how do I get onto Flare? Do I need a new wallet? Do I need a new set of assets that I don't currently produce? How do I pay for things like gas? Do I need the native token? How does one get into the ecosystem? And do you see kind of eventually maybe building to what Chainlink is developed with CCIP? Or do you have other ideas on potentially more secure path there?
We've just done a partnership with Layer 0 Stargate, which already essentially is handling that kind of messaging that CCIP is trying to get to. And I think the first version of Layer 0 I would have balked at in terms of its safety, but their V2 architecture, which allows for decentralized validated networks, of which we could potentially build our own DVN. Flare is kind of already a DVN, we would just need to figure out how to integrate that specifically with Layer 0. And that's kind of there out of the box with Flare, but more specifically, I think the DVN model is much more interesting than CCIP because it's modular. So it has modular security, meaning for a very low value transaction, I can choose a DVN that maybe has 10 people. It's not really important. It's maybe $1, $5. For a very high value transfer, I can kind of customize my security by choosing some set of DVNs. That's really much more interesting than trying to create one cohesive network from my perspective for that kind of thing. I think interoperability solutions are broadly fairly well catered for. I do think there's complexities in some of them. I think the DVN model, essentially the modular security that things like Layer 0 offer, is probably about as good as you can get.
Yeah, that's great. I think Layer 0 is a really interesting alternative to CCIP. So that's exciting to know that it's already connected to the network. So maybe contextualize a little bit, like who's using Flare today and where have you maybe seen some of the sweet spots in terms of things that people are able to do given your unique architecture relative to, say, Ethereum?
We have quite a sizable number of people that have decided to build on the chain. So we have really a lot of DeFi protocols at this point. So Gnosis being one of the first, that there are DEX and a lending protocol, Stargate I just mentioned, and Layer 0, Kinetic lending protocol, the same group that built Benki. They've also built something called Scepter, which is a liquid version of our stake token. We have Spark DEX, which is both a V2, a V3 Uniswap, and a Perps DEX. There's quite a large group of entities that have built. Those are the ones that have come on very recently. Obviously, we have quite a few partnerships with a lot of entities around the space that do validation, professional validation. One of the data providers on Flare, they're providing data and doing validation, is Google Cloud. So I think when we talk to developers, they absolutely love what Flare is doing and why. And that's because basically if they're on the Ethereum architecture, their principal way to consume data is Chainlink. That really sort of goes to the differences of Flare and Chainlink. For starters, Flare is a EVM layer 1 with enshrined oracles. Chainlink's a third-party data provider. And we have 4 real key differences: decentralization, security, cost, and ease of use. We've really been through decentralization. Chainlink's most demanded feed has, I think, 31 providers, none of whom are staked. I believe they have some kind of staking system in beta, but they have, I think in their beta, they have about 7% of their token that is staked. So there are 31 data providers in their most used price, and they have 11 in their least used price. Whereas, as I said on Flare, all 100 are providing that information. In terms of stake, Chainlink's using 7%, we're at about 67%. So these elements really mean that you're just trusting Chainlink. And so developers really, really like the aspect about Flare that they feel more comfortable. And our feeds are much, much cheaper. In fact, all of them are currently free. And there will be the opportunity to pay later when you're demanding more complex data, more expensive data to retrieve. So that is built into the system already. But I think the biggest thing that really matters to engineers is, at least from the construction of the app side, is the ease of use. When you are a developer looking at using existing Oracle systems, you have to analyze the security of each feed. And this means that developers not only are having to build a product, but they're also having to be risk analysts, which they don't really want to be. And so I don't think forcing developers to analyze the risk of your pricing is a sensible thing. So this really makes for developers a much greater experience in and encourages innovation both on Flare, but also on innovation of data. Because when we add a feed, it has the same safety as the most demanded feed. And so it means if a developer wants new data, then we can add that feed and that data can be consumed, and that really encourages innovation. So broadly, if you're developing on Ethereum, it's a fantastic platform, as is, to be honest with you, Solana. But I think they've done some very interesting things. I don't necessarily appreciate all of them, but they're great platforms. But ultimately, if you want data, you have very limited choices.
Yeah. One of the things that occurred to me while you were explaining that is, like, when I think about sort of pricing failures that have been spectacular, it's typically been in the context of like a flash loan attack, where I'm able to buy fairly thinly traded or low supply token, manipulate the price in some way, take a loan against that inflated value, then convert that loaned asset into some other asset, stable coins or whatever, and kind of run off with the money and never pay the loan back. And at least as I understand those failures, and maybe you'll tell me I'm wrong, it's less about the data feed setting the prices in the lending protocol being corrupted themselves, and it's more about relying on a single price or this easily manipulated price. So it's not strictly an Oracle failure, at least as I've understood it, but maybe I've gotten this all wrong.
And there's a bunch of different ways you can have Oracle failure.
Yeah.
For instance, with existing Oracle systems, there was very clear manipulation by the data providers in the early days. And I don't know if it still exists, but certainly in the early days, there was very clear manipulation by the data providers, principally because one of those data providers was FTX or Alameda, I can't remember. And so that was an absolute Oracle design failure, if your data providers can manipulate your feed. I'd also argue that a lot of the reasons you haven't seen these kind of things is because there's really a pretense of decentralization within these things. Essentially, the data providers know the founder of the project, and that's all well and good until the absolute second it isn't. And that's, to me, a bit like a turkey voting for Christmas. But there's a number of other ways that oracles can go wrong. You can have engineering mistakes, which I think was the most recent Oracle issue with Row. Essentially, someone took over the contract because probably, I think a private key leaked or something like that, where you shouldn't be able to, if you engineer a protocol properly, you shouldn't be able to take over the contract from a single private key. That's not sensible. On Flare, we try to rectify that with very, very extensive auditing and testing, then testing on a testnet, then testing on a canary net, and then we roll it out to Flare. Our canary net's called Songbird. You can have bad protocol design. I'd say, that's what happens when you have limited number of data providers providing a particular price. The protocol is designed to allow for a limited number of data protocols to provide a price, rather than on Flare, we have essentially all data providers must provide the price, otherwise they don't get rewards. And so that's that's your protocol design. You have missed updates, and that has happened on Chainlink. This is from a lack of data providers. Flare doesn't suffer from that. Lack of decentralization is obviously the big one. And then the biggest one that matters to me, and the thing that is the mismatching your safety budget relative to the value of the protocols that your Oracle is serving. Obviously, if the stake you have at risk is less than the value from an attack, then the probability of the Oracle stealing the money is higher.
Yeah. I'm curious, kind of going down the path of decentralization, one of the things that it seems like a number of teams building on Solana are attempting to do is create fully on-chain order books. And it seems like the gap to doing that on other chains has been primarily one of performance. At least that's how it's been articulated by the folks who have chosen to build on Solana, where you've got this higher transaction throughput. But you chose to build on the EVM chain. Like, any thoughts on that? Is like trying to deliver an on-chain order book in the long-term roadmap, or is that something?
Well, we actually have a project on Flare that I should have mentioned earlier called Brainlang that has built an on-chain order book, essentially an on-chain order book through solvers. So you submit the things you wish to trade around, your prices and all that kind of stuff on-chain, and then the solvers essentially create those trades once the price is hit. So I think that's like an interesting way to do it for the EVM world. And our sort of interest is in developer adoption. Obviously, Solana has had a lot of adoption now, although I would question how much of it's real versus how much of it's just meme coins. There's a lot of meme coins. The ratio is probably 95-5, but I'm not certain. And EVM has generally been, and I think continues to be, the broad mechanism for adoption of a layer 1 or a layer 2. I think the biggest aspect of this is, can you take compute off chain if you really want high performance? Because you can't, even Solana proves that you can't have extensive decentralization if you want very high performance using on-chain compute. So what compute can you take off-chain that allows you to get that performance without sacrificing too much decentralization?
Interesting. So it sounds like you're suggesting the Oracle architecture native to Flare allows you to potentially take more compute off-chain.
I mean, the Oracle architecture is an off-chain compute system to start with. So we're broadly just doing proofs of everything.
Fascinating. Totally different direction for my next question. The big sort of tug of war, I think, in the industry right now relates to responsibility at the chain and protocol level and token issuer level for what's happening in the ecosystem, right? Sort of where we have this multi-layered know your customer anti-money laundering regime and kind of traditional finance. Like, can that be replayed across crypto ecosystem? I'm curious to hear where you fall on kind of the view of that push from regulators generally, and then specifically anything that maybe is happening in the Flare ecosystem potentially related to permissioning or KYC that's maybe native in the network.
And so I think at base, the native token and the network itself has to be permissionless and decentralized. Otherwise, there's no point being here. I think there are aspects, especially when you're touching real world assets, which absolutely and very clearly meet the definitions under all regulations pretty much. And so I think when you're doing things that are regulated, you absolutely have to fit into the regulated framework. I don't think that, if you think about it, this space started out as a reaction to the global fiat system. And there's two ways that it can become the system. And that is either through an abject failure of the existing system or through regulation accepting that it becomes a bigger part of the system. And so either you have all your chips on an abject failure, at which point crypto fills the void, or you accept that crypto isn't going to immediately tomorrow take over the entire space and the entire financial industry, and you accept that regulation where you build something that fits into the regulatory purview must exist and must happen. And with our data angle, we think that compliance and KYC and AML and being able to prove those kind of things is something that Flare is going to capitalize on. In terms of permissioning, I probably haven't gotten on to some of the protocols we're building, but we're building an over-collateralized bridge for Bitcoin and XRP, so that to bring that to Flare, over-collateralized with stables and Flare. And some entities within that bridge will want the ability to do KYC and on the counterparties that they're interacting. Not all of them, but some of them. So we're building in KYC to that system as an optional aspect. That's
really interesting. Say more about that. So the built-in KYC, is that an on-chain validation system, or you're doing kind of an off-chain?
It would be essentially, it's at the discretion of the party that is operating. It's a little complex to describe how the bridge operates. Essentially, it has an entity. It's more like a series of small bridges, but it's one protocol where each, let's say I am an entity, I put up collateral. This allows me to receive Bitcoin, and against that, my receipt of Bitcoin, I am issued, or whoever sent me the Bitcoin is issued Flare Bitcoin. And that is secured through my collateral that I've put up on. Now, in some cases, I may want to be able to KYC who is minting with me and redeeming with me. And so building in KYC, basically building a KYC function into the protocol helps with that. And then the agent who's provided the collateral and is kind of doing this work, they can go to any off-chain KYC provider that they like, that they're happy with. Ultimately, we'd like to bring the whole thing on-chain if possible.
Yeah, it seems like the missing ingredient to bring something on-chain is like a verifiable proof of identity. There's lots of projects who are working on this, but it doesn't seem like we've actually settled on a particular one that people trust and will use reliably. And we're stuck doing everything in a paper context.
Well, I think for a start, what I would like is for our agents in this system to be able to demonstrate. I called the Chainalysis API. This address that I'm interacting with was not on any list, was not on any blacklist. There was no evidence that this was a bad person. That's a really good start.
I totally agree. I appreciate the shout out there. That's an architecture I think we could get behind. Hugo, this has been a fantastic discussion. My customary closing question is always a look towards the future. What's coming on the roadmap for Flare that people should be watching out for?
So I completely missed two things in this call, which was the Flare data connector, which is our ability to prove Web 2 and Web 3 events. So that's coming on Flare towards September or October.
Talk a little bit more about that one. So the ability to prove Web 2 events sounds fantastical to me. What does that mean in practice? Give us an example.
So it means basically using our data providers, the same entities that are providing prices, for providing, essentially you request an attestation from Web 2 API, and our data providers go to that Web 2 API, and essentially we have a proofing system that uses Merkle trees, and each event is a Merkle tree leaf. We end up proving the root. So that means we can end up proving in a single cycle, we can prove almost an unbounded number of events. That event proof can then be used on-chain by any dApp that needs it.
Wow, that sounds amazing. So that's launching in September.
Yeah, so it should be around September, October time. And then I think I split this question into a couple of things. Also, we have a whole compute strategy, which I probably don't want to, off-chain compute strategy using trusted execution environments, which I probably don't need to get into right now, but we're doing a very fun hackathon around that in October. In the industry, I'm looking forward to seeing more forms of account abstraction. Specifically, one of our use cases we think for trusted execution environments is sort of things like account abstraction, being able to make it lower the barrier to entry for people to use blockchains. It would be really cool to make it just so much easier than a traditional wallet. I'm pretty interested to see how the political calculus shakes out.
We all are.
And whether, depending on who wins, whether any of the promises that are made to the crypto community end up in anything concrete. And then on Flare, we have the second version of our Oracle, so our what we call FTSO v2, so our price Oracle going onto mainnet in September, also in September. We've got the launch of that bridge I was just discussing called the F assets, so being able to bridge Bitcoin and XRP onto Flare. Can't tell you exactly when that launch will be, but it will certainly be fairly soon. And so those are some of the things happening there.
It sounds like a really busy fall for you all. Is that hackathon you mentioned open to the public? Anyone can participate?
Absolutely, it'll be at permission.
Awesome. We will link to the details in the show notes so that people listening can go and find it. And if you're interested, hopefully by the time we publish this podcast. Hugo, this has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like I learned a ton. Thank you so much.
Oh, great. My pleasure. Thank you.
Mission Control, we have liftoff.